Sure, here's a gripping introduction for your YouTube video story. I never expected my uncle's final moments to change everything I thought I knew about my family. But as I stood by his bedside, holding his frail hand, his voice barely above a whisper, he uttered a name I had never heard before. At first, I thought it was just the ramblings of a man slipping away. But then his eyes locked onto mine with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. He wasn't confused. He was confessing, and what he said next shattered everything. Growing up, I always saw Uncle Richard as the quiet one in the family. He wasn't the type to share much about his past, but he had this air of mystery about him, like he had lived through things none of us could imagine. He had never married, never had kids of his own, and never seemed to mind spending holidays alone. My parents used to say he was just a private person, but now I wonder, was he keeping a secret this entire time? The hospital room was silent except for the beeping of the machines. My mother stood on the other side of the bed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My father had his arms crossed, staring at the floor, lost in thought. And then there was me, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. Uncle Richard struggled for breath, his grip tightening around my fingers. His eyes, filled with regret, darted toward my mother. And then he said it again. The name, this time louder, more urgent. My mother's face went pale. My father looked up, his expression shifting from sadness to something else, something darker. And in that moment, I realized they knew. They knew exactly who my uncle was talking about. But before I could press for answers, the machines let out a long, piercing sound. The nurses rushed in, and just like that, he was gone. The room felt colder, the air heavier. I turned to my mother, demanding to know what that name meant. But she just shook her head, whispering, "Not now." My father grabbed her arm, leading her toward the door, leaving me standing there, drowning in questions. Who was this person, and why did my uncle use his last breath to bring them up? What I didn't know was that this name, this one word, was about to unravel a family scandal so shocking, so deeply buried, that no one ever thought it would come to light. Secrets that had been locked away for decades were about to surface, and once they did, nothing would ever be the same again. But the real question is, was I ready to uncover the truth? Because once you open a door like this, there's no turning back. And what I found? Well, let's just say it changed everything. I couldn't sleep that night. My uncle's final words echoed in my head over and over again. That name? Who was it? Why did my mother and father react like that? I tried searching for it online, hoping maybe it would lead me somewhere, but nothing came up. It was as if this person didn't exist, or worse, someone had made sure they didn't. The next morning, I expected my parents to bring it up, to explain everything, but they acted as if nothing had happened. My mother made breakfast in silence, her eyes puffy, moving around the kitchen like she was on autopilot. My father buried himself in his phone, barely looking up. It was frustrating. They knew something, but they were choosing to pretend they didn't. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my plate aside and asked, "Who was he talking about?" My mother froze, her hands gripping the counter. My father exhaled loudly, rubbing his temples like he had been waiting for this moment. But instead of answering, he shook his head. "Drop it," he said, his voice firm. "Drop it?" I repeated, my voice rising. Uncle Richard's last words were about this person. He was trying to tell us something. My mother turned around, eyes filled with something between fear and sadness. "Some things are better left in the past," she whispered. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're seriously just going to pretend like this never happened?" Neither of them answered. The silence in the room was unbearable. That's when I knew, whatever this was, it was big. It wasn't just an old family story or some distant relative no one talked about. This was something they had worked hard to bury, and Uncle Richard, with his dying breath, had tried to dig it up. I decided I had to find out the truth on my own. If they weren't going to talk, I'd start somewhere else. I thought about Uncle Richard's house, the one he had lived in for as long as I could remember. Maybe there was something there, old letters, documents, anything that could give me a clue. The next day, I drove over. His house felt different now, like it carried the weight of all the secrets he never got to tell. As I walked through the front door, the air was thick with dust and memories. His old armchair sat untouched, a stack of books still piled next to it. Everything was exactly as he had left it. I started searching his desk, drawers, even the attic. Hours passed with nothing. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. Tucked away inside an old wooden box, hidden beneath faded photographs, was a single envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was sealed. My name was written on the front. Uncle Richard had left me something, and whatever was inside was meant for me to find. My hands shook as I turned the envelope over, my name written in Uncle Richard's familiar handwriting. It felt heavier than it should, like whatever was inside carried a weight far beyond just paper. I hesitated for a moment, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then, slowly, I slid my finger under the seal and tore it open. Inside was a single letter, written in ink that had faded slightly with time. The first line sent a chill down my spine. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it's time you learned the truth. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the page. Uncle Richard wrote about a secret buried deep within our family, something that had been hidden for decades. He spoke of betrayal, of lies that had shaped everything we thought we knew. And then, there it was again, the same name he whispered on his deathbed. He said this person was the key to everything, that their story had been erased, their existence covered up, and that my parents, my own parents, had played a part in it. My hands tightened around the paper. What could they have done? What could possibly be so terrible that they refused to even speak about it? A sudden noise startled me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the door. Someone was outside. I could see the shadow shifting through the curtains. My heart pounded. Had my parents followed me here? Had they realized I was digging into something they wanted left buried? I shoved the letter into my pocket, my mind racing. If they knew I had this, I wasn't sure what they'd do. I needed to act like nothing had happened. I needed to leave before they started asking questions. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop now. Uncle Richard had trusted me with the truth, and I had to find out what my family had been hiding, no matter the cost. I slipped the letter into my jacket, my mind spinning with questions. Whoever was outside hadn't knocked, hadn't called out my name. They were just standing there, waiting. My pulse quickened. I needed to get out of here before I found out who it was the hard way. Moving as quietly as I could, I stepped toward the back door. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I froze. The shadow outside shifted slightly, like they had heard me. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was watching me. I couldn't just leave through the front. If it was my parents, they'd demand to know what I found. And if it was someone else, someone connected to the secret Uncle Richard had been trying to reveal, I wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. I eased open the back door, slipping out into the cold air. My car was parked down the street, just far enough that I'd have to walk past the front of the house to get to it. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm, to move slowly, like I wasn't hiding something. As I reached the side of the house, I glanced toward the porch. A figure stood there, partially hidden in the dim light. My stomach dropped. It was my father. His face was unreadable, but his stance was tense. He had followed me here. I knew if I ran, it would confirm his suspicions. So I took a deep breath and stepped out onto the sidewalk. His eyes locked onto mine. "What were you doing inside?" His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it, something unsteady. "Just looking through Uncle Richard's things," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "I thought maybe I could find something to remember him by." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he exhaled and nodded. "Come home, now." I hesitated. He had never spoken to me like that before. So sharp, so final. He wasn't asking. He was ordering. And that's when I realized. He knew I had found something. Maybe not the letter itself, but he knew. And the way he was looking at me, it wasn't anger. It was fear. I followed my father to the car, every step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't say a word as we drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to be the first to acknowledge. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but inside my pocket, my fingers curled around Uncle Richard's letter. I wasn't letting it go, not now. When we pulled into the driveway, my mother was already waiting at the door. She looked from my father to me, her face tense, as if she already knew something was wrong. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice careful. I hesitated, but before I could answer, my father spoke. "He was snooping around Richard's house." The way he said it, accusatory, almost defensive, sent a shiver through me. It wasn't just that they were hiding something. It was that they were afraid of me finding out. I met my mother's eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" She opened her mouth, but my father shot her a warning look. That's when I knew. She wanted to talk. He was the one stopping her. My hands clenched at my sides. "Uncle Richard left me a letter," I said, watching their reactions carefully. My mother's breath hitched. My father's entire body stiffened. "Give it to me," he said. I shook my head. "No." His expression darkened. "You don't understand what you're messing with." I stepped back, my heart pounding. "Then explain it to me," I shouted, "because I'm done with the secrets. Uncle Richard wanted me to know the truth. Why are you trying so hard to bury it?" Silence. My mother looked away, tears welling in her eyes. My father's jaw tightened, like he was battling something inside himself. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, my mother whispered, "Because someone already died because of it." The room spun. My breath caught. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she had just said. Someone had died. Because of this secret. I felt the weight of the letter in my pocket like it was burning through the fabric. And for the first time, I realized maybe I wasn't supposed to know the truth. Maybe knowing was dangerous. The room felt like it was closing in on me. My mother's words echoed in my head. Someone already died because of it. I didn't want to believe it, but the way she looked at my father, the way his face turned pale, told me it was true. My hands trembled as I pulled the letter from my pocket. "Uncle Richard wanted me to know," I said, my voice shaking. "So I'm going to read it." My father lunged for it, but I stepped back, ripping the envelope open before he could stop me. My mother gasped, covering her mouth, and my father let out a sharp breath, like he had lost the fight. My eyes scanned the words as fast as I could, and with every sentence, the pieces started falling into place. The name Uncle Richard whispered, the one my parents refused to acknowledge. It was my father's brother, an uncle I had never known, a man whose existence had been completely erased. According to the letter, he had been accused of something terrible, something that tore the family apart. But here was the twist. Uncle Richard claimed he had been innocent. The real culprit had framed him, and in the chaos that followed, my missing uncle had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some believed he had run away. Others suspected worse. I looked up at my father, my heart pounding. "You knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You knew he didn't do it." He didn't deny it. His eyes were hollow, filled with a lifetime of guilt. "We had to protect the family," he finally said. "It was too late to undo what happened." A chill ran down my spine. The truth wasn't just buried, it had been deliberately erased. And the worst part? My father had been part of it. Uncle Richard had spent his life trying to clear his brother's name, and now, with his dying breath, he had left that responsibility to me. The real question was, what was I going to do with the truth? Because once it was out, there would be no going back. The weight of the truth settled over me like a heavy fog. My father stood there, silent, his face lined with regret. My mother turned away, wiping her eyes, as if seeing the truth written on paper made it unbearable. I had spent my whole life believing my family was built on love and trust, but now I saw the cracks, the shadows hiding beneath. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream at my father, to demand why he let his own brother be erased, why he chose silence over justice. But as I looked at him, I saw a man who had been carrying this burden for years, a man who had made a choice he could never undo. Maybe he thought he was protecting us. Maybe he believed it was better this way. But Uncle Richard hadn't. He had spent his life chasing the truth, and in the end, he had passed it to me. I took a deep breath, clutching the letter. "I won't let this stay buried," I said finally. My father closed his eyes, as if he had been expecting those words. My mother reached for my hand, her touch trembling. "Just be careful," she whispered. For the next few weeks, I dove into everything Uncle Richard had left behind. Old letters, newspaper clippings, records that had been hidden away. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep the cover-up had gone. It wasn't just my family. Other people had played a part in keeping this secret buried. But now, the truth was in my hands. I didn't know what would happen when I told the world. I didn't know if it would bring justice or just reopen wounds that had never healed. But one thing was certain. Uncle Richard's last words weren't in vain. As I stood outside his house one last time, I looked up at the sky, the weight on my chest a little lighter. The truth was finally coming to light, and no matter what happened next, I knew I had done the right thing.